Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 41 of our reading of Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, 26 Unforgettable Explorations into the Realm of the Supernatural, adapted by Walter B. Gibson. We'll be going over the copyright information now. I just have to find it in the book. It clearly says here, Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone is copyright 1963 by Cayuga Productions Incorporated, and Rod Serling's Twilight Zone Revisited, copyright 1964 by Cayuga Productions Incorporated, all rights reserved. It says this 1983 edition is published by Bonanza Books, distributed by Outlet Book Company, Incorporated, a Random House Company, and the address is there if you want it. This book was previously published as two separate works entitled Rod Serling's Twilight Zone and Rod Serling's Twilight Zone Revisited. Printed and bound in the United States of America, and the Library of Congress. Information is there too if you want it. Anyways, we've been reading The Ghost Train, and Pete relayed his story, and nobody believed him because steam trains don't really exist anymore. It's the 60s. So, anyways, we are going to continue. Apparently, the editor called, and so now is their chance to go back and see the house that they picked up this ghostly little girl and took her home or something. So, anyways, let's pick this up. Okay, here we are. Pete's chance came when the editor of the Classic called him by long distance the next evening. Send in your ski story and Bert's photos by messenger, the editor ordered. I want you and Bert to spend the rest of the week driving around the reservoir. Section. Last summer we had the biggest drought since 1900 or whatever those valleys were dammed up. I want a picture story showing how low the water really is. But there's been a lot of snow up here, Chief. I know that, but until it melts, the reservoirs won't get any of it. I want those pictures right now, understand? I sure do, Chief. Pete could have shouted for sheer triumph, but instead he calmed himself, looked up Bert, and told him about the new assignment. The next day they began their tour midway between Iron Mountain and New York City, where the reservoirs formed a sinuous chain winding in and out of long-drowned valleys with extensions spread out like a starfish representing flooded creek beds and ravines. There were many bridges, all of the steel cantilever types, crossing narrows where the reservoirs linked. There were also side roads that took the long way around the deeply indented shores and even crossed the big dams. These were connected by a maze of lesser roads, some winding deep down into valleys outside the reservoir district. Pete took the side roads often, claiming they were shortcuts, but he lost time when forced to inch the car down icy slopes along rickety fence rails with deep gorges below, but in no case did he come to a sharp turn across a covered bridge and down a hill to a dead-end lane with a cottage hidden amid the evergreens. That vista had vanished, and so had any semblance of a railroad crossing where the ghost train had slicked by. So Pete concentrated on the reservoirs, stopping at turnabouts where Bert could take pictures, or letting Bert out of the car so he could scramble over the double cable of a guardrail and wade through the snow to get closer to the shore. The reservoirs were indeed desperately low, where the water should have been lapping at the top of the embankment. There would be a huge gaping basin 40 feet or more down to the water's edge. Stranded rowboats used for fishing indicated how the waters had steadily receded. Along with those, Bert took shots of snow-clad meadows skirted by old stone walls, farm sites of a century ago. Those were level portions of rolling hillsides that had become shoals after the valleys had been inundated and turned into man-made lakes. Bert took fine close shots of some scenes, including some with a telescopic lens, and he was sure that the cameras unflinching eye would bring out details that escaped human scrutiny. From a distant lookout, he pointed out a few to Pete, who noted them down for his story. See those two blocks of stone just poking out of the water, Bert said. That must be an abutment of an old bridge. You can see a gully leading down to it like a letter V in the snow. That's probably where the stream came from. But no roads could have gone across them, agreed Pete. Look at how steep the sides of the reservoir are. It must have swung up at an angle, Bert decided, following along the line of that stone wall up to the road that skirts the high ground above the rim of the reservoir. I guess you're right, Bert. Pete tried to trace the road down to an ice-covered stretch of water, only to note something else. What do you make of that square enclosure with stone walls about it? An old cemetery, Bert identified it. They say that woods are full of them in these parts. Some of them date back to before the Revolution. Every family had their own graveyard. That was just one sample of many observations and discussions during the daily rounds. Every night they arrived back at Iron Mountain Lodge, where Bert Carey turned in dog-tired from lugging his camera through snowbanks. Even following morning, Pete Dunning took delight in waking Bert up with an announcement. 3 C's again today. My boy, let's go. The 3 C's referred to the daily weather bulletin posted on a special board stating, continued cold and clear. That was poison to Bert, for it meant another long and grueling trip over the seemingly endless maze of roads with Pete as a rigorous task manager. But Pete himself had shown signs of frustration towards the end of the week. When clouds began to gather in mid-afternoon, Pete halted the car at a turnout above a reservoir that looked like a collection of patchy frozen pools. We've been over this before, he declared. In fact, we've covered everything. Let's call it a day. Covered everything, Bert chuckled, except maybe covered bridges and railroad crossings. Pete gave him an annoying glance that prompted Bert to continue. Not a single railroad line anywhere between here except over toward Long Ridge and the one that cuts across near Iron Mountain. They're both outside the reservoir district, or pretty near so. So what? Pete demanded. You should ask, so where? Replied Bert. Because where are you going to find a railroad crossing that doesn't exist? Pete couldn't answer that, though he wished he could, but he found one question he could answer. When they pulled into the lodge at Iron Mountain and read a new weather report, the 3 C's had been crossed out, and chalked in its place was a warning, big snow later. It won't be much later, Pete decided, noting heavy clouds above Iron Mountain. Right after dinner, I'm going to drive into the city, taking your photos with me so that the Classic will be sure to get its precious reservoir story. You can cover the ski contest for me, Bert, and I'll borrow one of your cameras in case I see a deer or something that would make a nice night shot to add to the reservoir pictures. It was already snowing when Pete started to the city, and as he drove along, the flurries developed into a full-fledged storm. Pete's only worry was that it might change to rain, for it was getting late in the winter. Sleet would make the roads icy and driving dangerous, but that wasn't the worst part. Gradually, Pete had come to the conclusion that there was something truly uncanny about the ghost train, and that the old road with the covered bridge and dead-end lane figured deeply into the mystery. Pete was sure he couldn't have been dreaming that other night, yet his reservoir assignment and the days of comparatively good driving had enabled him to double-check the entire area. By a process of rational elimination, Pete had formed the theory that the hour, the season, and particularly the weather might be a factor that could lead to a duplication of the events. Fantastic, perhaps, where fantastic. Perhaps where the ghost train was concerned, but after all, the ghost train was fantastic in itself. But that didn't apply to the sleigh bells and the girl named Ethel who wanted a lift home. They still could be, there could still be some old fashioned sleighs in use around these parts, but they wouldn't be out unless the roads were packed with snow, as they had been that night. Now, tonight, the snow was piling up again. Delay didn't matter. Pete had timed this trip to allow for that. The more snow, the more chance of hearing sleigh bells, was the way he reasoned it. Big drifts were forming across the road when Pete reached the town of Lansford, where house lights were barely visible in the swirl. Conditions seemed to be identical with those of the other night. From Lansford, Pete tried to pick his old route in reverse. He'd been doing that all week during his daylight excursions, but always he had missed out. He had always missed out. Now, by avoiding all those mistaken turns, he hoped to find the elusive railroad crossing, but the snow was pouring into his windshield with blizzard force. So Pete was completely lost, his only consolation being that he had been lost like that the time before. Still, a bad skid could pitch the station wagon into a gully or a gorge, and it might be all up to Pete Dunning. At times he thought he could hear the rush of water far below, and he was straining his ears as well as his eyes when he caught the distant jingle of the other night. Sleigh bells. Pete could have laid it to his imagination, but they grew louder, which made sense because he was traveling in the other direction tonight, and the sleigh, if following the same route, would be approaching him. Then the prospect of the railroad crossing suddenly struck Pete, and he jammed on the brakes just in time. As the wagon swerved, Pete saw red lights flashing and a terrific jangle drowning the sleigh bells. While Pete was rolling the window down, a great hulk of blackness roared across the road, and as before he saw the flaring firebox of the old steam locomotive. Pete grabbed the camera too late, but as the line of weird white cars clicked by, he managed to get a picture of their lighted windows. He tried for another of the observation platform, but the ghost train had gone by too soon. The next act followed as Pete was straightening the car. Again, the girl with the flowing coat stepped out of the blizzard into the glare of the headlights. This time she was on Pete's side of the crossing, and hardly had she given her plaintive cry, "Please, please, take me to my father's home," before she was on the far side of the car, and Pete was opening the door for her. Straight ahead, he said with a nod, then a turn off to the left. "No," the girl objected. "We'll have to turn around first. My father's house is in the other direction." So it was. Considering that Pete was coming the other way, he bumped across the tracks, found a place to turn, and went back over the crossing, where the lights were out by now and the bells were silent. Pete would have liked to have taken another picture right then, but he decided to wait until after he had taken the girl home. From then on, the trip was strangely like that of the other night. The girl again told Pete that her father was ill and that they only had a little ways to go. Her words turned sharply here, across the covered bridge, then sharply again down the long hill, was springing into Pete's mind before the girl pronounced them. Then Pete asked the girl's name, and she replied, "Ethel." He declared, "Mine is Pete Dunning. That's my full name." "And yours?" "Ethel Barsden," the girl informed him. "Turn here." Then Oh, there are the lights of the house. You can stop in front. Again, the girl's hand was pressing Pete's arm, as on that other night, but she gave no sign of recognizing him. This time, however, Pete did not intend to let Ethel slip away as quickly as she had before. Even as Pete stopped the car, he peeled the glove back from his right hand and pressed his hand upon hers, but the surprise that he received was far more startling than her elusive way of slipping from sight. To describe that hand as icy cold would have been putting it in the mildest terms. The mere touch shot a paralyzing chill clear up Pete's arm, sending a convulsive shiver through his entire body. Pete was numbed both physically and mentally, and the effect must have been more than momentary, for though his hand recoiled automatically, he found himself clenching and unclenching his fingers to learn if they were still capable of action, and during that interim, his thoughts underwent a total lapse. By then the girl was gone again, and Pete couldn't remember hearing her open and close the door, though through his mind were echoing her same parting words. Good night and many thanks. This time Pete didn't wait to back the car around. His hand was at least nimble enough to reach the far door and grab the window handle, which cold though it was, seemed warm compared to the girl's icy touch. As he brought the window down with a few quick turns, Pete glimpsed Ethel's flowing coat and close-fitting bonnet as she started down the pathway to the house. He caught up the camera and the camera in one quick sweep, trained it from the window, and called, "Ethel, wait!" Pete was sure he saw the girl turn, and he snapped the shot, for her face came vividly before his eyes as the bulb flashed. Pale almost as the snow, her features were etched against the dark background of her cape and bonnet. Then she was gone, and Pete hurriedly backed the car so that the headlights again cut a swath along the pathway to the house. All in the same action, Pete opened the door beside the wheel and sprang out to the driveway with the camera. He was working so quickly tonight that he again caught sight of Ethel as she reached the house, a small white cottage just within range of the headlights. By the time Pete got the camera into action and took the shot, Ethel must have gone inside, for she was no longer in sight when Pete looked again. Back in the car, Pete swung about and headed up the road through the covered bridge. He was clocking the speedometer tonight, making mental notes of it. Somehow he missed the railroad crossing, but soon he reached a bridge leading to the Upstate Parkway. There, Pete took an inbound lane, speaking to himself half aloud. Ethel Barsden. That was her full name, so it should be easy to trace her when I do. I hope she won't be mad because I took those pictures. She might give me a stare as cold as those hands of hers. Pete stopped at the canteen for coffee, and while he was drinking it, he looked about and asked, "Where's old Smedley?" He only fills in occasionally," replied the manager, "so he won't be around for another week or so. Anything special?" "I want to find a family named Barsden who live near here. I wouldn't know them. Smedley is the man to ask." Pete managed to reach New York City before it was snowed under. He had his pictures developed along with Brett's in the dark room at the newspaper office. Brett's came out fine, but Pete's did not. The windows of the ghost train showed simply as streaks of light that night. That might have been fireworks or shooting stars. The flash that Pete had taken of the girl was a splotch of black on a muddy background, more like a bush than a human figure. When Pete studied the last picture, Buckley, the man in charge of the darkroom, looked at it and asked, "What is that supposed to be, a big snowbank?" "It's a cottage," Pete exclaimed. "A girl was walking along the path leading to it, but she went inside before I got the shot." "If that's a path, what happened to her footprints?" For the first time, Pete realized that there weren't any. As for the cottage, it was so far out of focus that it did look like a mere snowbank. As before, the less Pete talked about his adventure, the better. For those pictures were damaging rather than helpful. The lack of footprints meant that the girl couldn't have walked along the path. Again, Pete was forced to wait for another snowy night. The current storm lasted only until late the next afternoon. The rest of the week, Pete was doing the reservoir story and covering old sports events. Then came a spell of warm weather that started to a sudden thaw, with predictions of heavy rains to follow, meaning there would be no more sleighing until next winter. Pete found time to study old maps of the upstate area and looked up names of families there, but the results were doubly disappointing. The maps were inadequate, and there was no Barsden located, either in old records or in modern directories. Pete was about to give the whole thing up when a real break came. The predicted rains came through as a late but heavy snow, and Pete was again sent to Iron Mountain to join Bert, who was up there waiting for the last of the winter sports, if there were any. The snow was heavy on the parkway when Pete hit the Woodland service station and learned that old Smedley wouldn't be back for a few days more. The manager advised Pete to get on to Iron Mountain as soon as he could, claiming that the snow might turn to freezing rain at any time. But Pete still took the shortcut as well as he could remember it. The roads were deep with snow, but he could hear the roar of creeks far below, all swollen by the recent thaw. Then suddenly those sounds faded, and distant sleigh bells came through with the familiar jingle. On the blinding Out of the blinding snow flared the big red lights, accompanied by the louder jangle. Pete still had the borrowed camera, but he didn't try to use it as the ghost train rolled past, its big locomotive and line of white to the complete to the eerie glow from its observation platform. Then Pete crossed the single track and slowed expectantly, wondering what he would do if Ethel Barsden failed to appear again. Suddenly there she was, flowing cloak, bonnet and all. Next she was in the car and was pointing the way down to the covered bridge, where the situation changed. Tonight, the tumult of a flooded creek was shaking the creaky old limbs. Pete stopped midway, wondering if it would be safe to go over. Ethel smiled reassuringly. You wouldn't be stopping to make a wish, or would you? You mean, should I wish that this bridge won't fall apart? No, silly. When you go through a covered bridge, you stop and wish for something nice to happen. And sometimes it does. Pete leaned towards Ethel and kissed her. Though her lips were cold, they were not icy, nor did her hands give him marrow-chilling shivers when he pressed them tonight. There were shivers, though, from the bridge as a gust of wind ripped loose boards from the superstructure and sent them clattering down to smack the creek below. We'd better go, Ethel decided. The old bridge may collapse at any time. They haven't kept it repaired because of what? Why, you know what they plan to do. Even in the dim light of the dashboard, Ethel's eyes were probing. They've talked about it so long, but I've got to get home. Her tone became anxious. My father is ill, and I promised I'd get back as soon as I could. Pete nodded and gave the girl's hand an encouraging pat. Then he gripped the wheel again, easing the car on through the bridge, hoping the timbers would hold until he made it. Turn sharply again, Ethel said, and down the long hill. But don't worry, we're almost there. As if Pete didn't know. He had heard this twice before, yet the girl again was treating him as a total stranger. Now she was saying, turn here, and Pete was on the point of introducing himself again when he realized that he had to snap out of this strange automatic mood that was like a record playing over and over. He reached to the dash and turned the car radio. A newscaster's voice broke in. Batten down the hatches for that big storm. Floods are already sweeping the southern states, and Our snow is turning to rain. Stay off the road and avoid fallen wires and washed out bridges. Ethel gave the newscast no attention until the word bridges snapped her to a sudden action. Her hands gripped Pete's arm, and there was a plea in the depth of her limpid eyes as she urged, "You must come with me right now. You must talk to my father and tell him how serious things are. He won't believe me, though. I've often tried to tell him, but he may not believe you." Pete jumped at the invitation. Tonight, the mystery girl wasn't going to slip from sight like the elusive ghost train. As Ethel opened the door on her side, Pete followed right after her, gripping her arm as they trudged knee-deep through the snow along the path to the cottage. There Pete opened the door for Ethel, and they went through a little entry into a fair-sized room where a balding man of about 40 was seated in an antique armchair by a crackling fire. Okay, this is kind of a cliffhanger to end it on, but we will have to do that. We've been reading from Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, 26 Unforgettable Explorations into the Realm of the Supernatural, adapted by Walter B. Gibson. And specifically, we have been reading the story The Ghost Train. If you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe, ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, if you want to support me in any way, if you want to join the Discord server, all that information will be in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.